Hi all, this is your Professor Ian. This is a video about an important concept that we're considering this week. It's a vital skill in any kind of writing, but especially short story, because short stories are such condensed pieces of writing. They often turn on, we've been talking about an epiphany, on realization, and what we're going to talk about right now. So that's Alanis Morissette, isn't it? Let me just show you some pictures and a short video, and then we'll talk about this. So, next one. All right, take a look there. Here we go. Just give you a minute to take in the lesson we're getting from these texts. You can read that, where the news hits home. Spelling, right? You can see I'm missing T there. Maybe a little less light of a picture, put it that way, a little more serious. And then finally, I'm going to show you a brief video. I'm just going to play this. Hopefully, it's kind of playing around with Screencast-O-Matic here. So let's see. Okay, so let's go back to my slides here. It's just a video from one of my favorite sites, the Onion. And of course, what we're talking about here is irony, right? We saw an example of these different kinds of irony going on here in all these different texts and videos. So irony, we can define it. Let me note before I get into this, irony is a notoriously tricky thing to fully define. There are scholars who would, say that this is far too simplistic, doesn't cover certain things. And that's fine. We're not here to totally nail down the concept of irony. We're just here to discuss it in a general way and use these ideas to help us think about some of the stories that we're reading and writing this semester. So irony we can define as a literary and rhetorical technique that deals with the gap between expectations and reality. The word, again, is hard to or impossible to define in full, but we're going to talk about three main kinds of irony here. Right? Verbal, situational, and dramatic. And these are the three main kinds of irony that we talk about, especially as people looking at short stories, especially these last two we'll look at. I just want to start with verbal, though, because this is the one we're most accustomed to. A lot of us are pretty proficient in verbal irony, right? Sarcasm is a kind of verbal irony that a lot of people use all the time, right? So verbal irony is a statement meant to reflect the opposite of what it actually means, right? It could be overstatement, understatement, or just saying the opposite, right? A couple examples. I really love to get up at 6 a.m. to catch the bus to work. Obviously, this person doesn't. Maybe some people do, but that's not many people, right? Saying the opposite is just a way of showing the gap between what you want and what you have to do, right? Again, that gap between expectations and reality. I guess if you twist my arm, I'd drink a beer with you, right? So these aren't really sarcasm, right? It's not really sarcastic, but that is what we call verbal irony. And sarcasm is, doing the same thing, but usually with this intent to insult, right? It can be playful. I'm very sarcastic with my friends. So I'm playfully insulting them, right? So, wow, Jim, those are really cool pants. I didn't know bell bottoms were back in. You were very fashion forward, right? So the opposite of what's the reality. They're not cool pants. They're geeky looking or whatever, and just playful banter, if you will. So verbal irony is something we're all used to. Getting into more literary kinds of irony, right? Situational irony. To begin with, so this is when the exact opposite of what is expected or planned for happens. So all those pictures I showed you at the beginning of the slideshow are examples of situational irony, right? More or less. And there's a difference between bad luck and situational irony, right? If you plan a picnic and it rains that day, that's not ironic. That doesn't quite meet that bar of irony, right? That's just bad luck. But as I note here, if you check the weather report and you did all this homework to find the one day that you thought it was not going to rain and you planned everything around that, and then it did rain, then you're getting into situational irony, right? Because you're building it up to the point where it gets more ironic. I guess you could call it ironic a little bit if you plan a picnic and it rains that day, but it's a very weak form of that, right? Um, and so, that's the Alanis Morissette I referenced at the beginning. Isn't it ironic? If you remember the lyrics of that song, most of her examples aren't really that ironic. It's more bad luck, right? Rains on your wedding day. Yeah, I mean, again, if it was built up and you planned, and then maybe you didn't get the tents for your guests because you knew it wasn't going to rain, then it rains. Okay, now we're getting into irony. But if it just rains on your wedding day, that's just, bad luck, right? More or less, or a very weak form of situational irony. And of course, again, the more you build this up, the more we can talk about it being ironic, right? And this one can become tragic, right? Irony with sarcasm, we're usually talking about humor, but irony is also used to describe darker situations, right? As I note here, become more tragic the greater the stakes are built by focusing on our attention on the gap between ideals and reality. For example, if we think about the Iraq War, if you go back to 2000, what was that, 3, 4, 2? I can't remember the exact year. Many American politicians and generals talked about how it would be this quick war. We just, American troops would like roll into Baghdad, finish the war that Bush started in the 90s, right, and bring liberty and peace. And as we know, that's not what happened, right? Iraq is still in turmoil. So, there's an irony between, or a gap between what people claimed would happen and the reality, right? And it's not funny, but we can describe this as situational irony, right? There's a gap between the two things. And in stories, what this irony does is it allows the author an opportunity to draw our attention to the reasons for this gap, right? To bring our attention to to why there's this gap between these two things. So I gave you Araby to read, and it has this irony at the end because things don't turn out as the narrator expected, right? There's this great sense of situational irony in that story. In the story, if you read it, the protagonist wants to achieve this thing, right, to impress his lady love, but it turns out the world is not as he thinks it is, right? And there's this big gap between his expectations of the world, right? He's going on this kind of like nightly quest to get this something for his lady love, and he discovers that the world doesn't really operate that way. And when he realizes there's this big gap, there's this ironic epiphany that he has at the end of the story, and that's what the author is kind of exploring in that story. What James Joyce is exploring in Araby is that process of maturation, of maturing that we all go through when we realize that the world is not as we expect it to be when we're younger, right? We all have expectations of how people treat each other, how love works, all that kind of stuff. And then we have those experiences where we realize, oh, that's not my kind of romantic or childish ideas about this are not how it works, right? Anyway, so if you read Araby, look for that situational irony. The other kind of irony, dramatic irony, is another very literary kind of irony, even more so, I guess, than situational irony, because it refers to situations when the audience or the reader has more details about the plot or character than the character in the work, right? We see this a lot in plays. I have a couple things here. If you've watched Friends or Frasier, irony works a lot in these two. Or The Office. I don't know if you watch The Office, but Michael Scott, the boss, he thinks he's a good boss. He thinks people like him. He's a likable person. He's a good person, all that kind of stuff. When we know that that's not true, right? The humor is he's always like doing things with the thought that he's really good at singing or entertaining people, or he's a great boss. And he always falls flat on his face because his expectations of what's going to happen are different than what happens. And we, the audience, get to enjoy that because we know he's a goofball, right? And we know that he's going to fail spectacularly in these situations. So there's that dramatic irony that creates the humor in a show like The Office or Frasier and Friends, right? In these two shows, there's always this kind of like misunderstanding with the characters. We, the audience watching, we know the whole story, and we see how, Joey is trying to hide something from Chandler or whatever. And the confusion that's going on creates this humor because we get the full view of it, whereas the characters involved don't. And we call that dramatic irony. Another good, more classical example, if you've read any Shakespeare, you're going to see some dramatic irony. But in Othello is one of my favorite plays to watch. Spoiler alert, I'm going to give some details about it. But for the entire play, Iago, who's Othello's advisor, is telling Othello that Desdemona is cheating on him. Desdemona is Othello's wife, and eventually Othello comes to believe him, and he's convinced that Desdemona's cheating on him. And at the end, almost one of the climax of the play, he murders Desdemona. He chokes her to death on stage. Very dramatic moment. But it's even more dramatic because we, the audience, know that Iago is lying to Othello. We know Desdemona is faithful and does not deserve. Well, I mean, nobody deserves to be murdered because they're unfaithful, but we know that she's faithful to Othello and does not deserve what's happening. We know Othello's making this giant mistake, and so when he murders her on stage, the tragedy is heightened because we know, and we know that Othello does not know. This dramatic irony creates this heightened um, tragedy on stage. And then after he murders her and he realizes what's happened, we get this catharsis when he finally realizes, oh, this is the truth. He gets his moment of realization, and we get the audience gets this like sense of relief because we're like, oh, finally he realizes, right? This dramatic irony kind of dissipates because he realizes, but then he realizes the terrible thing he's done, right? So, it's not a happy ending. Anyway, so that's dramatic irony. Those are the three kinds of irony we usually talk about: verbal, situational, dramatic. And that's something we're going to be looking at the two stories this week. And then I like this meme. What if ironic by Lance Morissette is ironic due to the lack of irony? Just a little mind trip for you. And that's it for now. Have a good week.